Thank you, and I can't tell you how much pleasure it gives me to be here. I first heard of the McFaddin-Ward house probably 35 years ago when one of the graduates from the program, Jessica Foy, came to work here as the curator. So I've known about it for a long time, but this is the first time that I've actually gotten here myself. So today's lecture is going to take us to watery places, hard water in one case, but I hope you will enjoy it. It's an outgrowth of work that I did when I worked for Mystic Seaport Museum, and I'd like to give a little hats off to the Seaport. Mystic Seaport Museum is the largest marine museum, maritime museum in the country, and has an unparalleled collection of watercraft. It has 450 small boats in its collection, which is really extraordinary, some of which date back 2 centuries at this point. I think the oldest one is 1807, and that's really remarkable. And the boats that I'm going to talk about tonight are outgrowths of work that I did as a researcher there at the Seaport. And I realized that we think extreme sports are something sort of new. And it's true that they all have a new twist on them. Who thought 50 years ago that sailboats could actually foil above the water and take their hulls completely out of the water? I mean, this is pretty remarkable, that they could move far faster, multiples faster than the wind itself that was propelling them. But the spirit that pushes people to sail on those boats and do silly things like jump off of mountains with a nylon blanket on oneself, that spirit is really as old as humans themselves. I mean, Icarus, put wings on and held them on with wax, and we know that didn't work out so well for him. So, and these guys maybe aren't that much different in some ways. But going back and looking at some of these sports with that attitude, with that perspective of thinking about how daring were people 150, 200 years ago, or more recently in some cases, how did they innovate? How did they take something, snowboarding, for instance, when you look at all of these people doing these pirouetting jumps 40 feet above the slopes in the Olympics, that started out by somebody saying, well, what else could I do with a snowboard? How could I use this differently and more dangerously than anybody had used it before? And we're going to look at some boats that started out as perfectly practical, solid, working boats and became something else over time. And we're going to start with the sandbagger. Sandbaggers, anybody in this room ever heard of a sandbagger? Raise your hand if you have. All right, we've got a couple of sandbaggers here. They were also known as bag wagons back then, and I'll get into why the sandbag word comes into the boat in a little bit, but they are dramatic, rakish-looking boats that look as if somehow they belong in a period more recent than the 1850s when the first ones start. This is a boat named Annie, which is the oldest boat in Mystic Seaport's collection. It was acquired in 1931. It's accession number 4, so it's a really early item in their collections. And it dates back to 1880, so it's quite an old boat. And it was restored to working condition about 15, 20 years ago. Now it's a static display. But you can get a sense of how many people are in that cockpit. It requires a big crew. But they started as a working sailboat. One of the secrets to getting older is always having the right kind of glasses for whatever you're doing, right? And it starts as something called the New York sloop boat. They were used in New York Harbor for moving cargo, moving passengers back and forth between the New York shore and the New Jersey shore, And they were used for fishing in and around New York Harbor as well. Oyster fishing, shad fishing, all kinds of fishing there. And if you look at them, you can see they've got sort of a sensible little sail plan, something that two people could easily handle. It would stay stable and upright, no problem. It's an easy boat to sail. But over time, you get two men in two different New York sloop boats, and they're both headed in the same direction, and I guarantee you that one of them is going to see whether he can go faster than the other one and prove that his boat is better. It's just a little testosterone on the water, I guess. So there was a lot of informal racing. It was just trying to see whether you could go faster than Jim, who had another boat. And over time, these races became a little bit more formal. And then some of the races became a little more formal, and they actually started having races against each other. And now they're trying to make their boats go faster. So how do you make the same hull go faster than somebody else's boat? Put a bigger sail plan on it. And the sail plans got bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to the point where there's the original New York sloop boat, and here's the sandbagger. The hull looks exactly the same. It has not changed. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people who were racing these on the weekend would take the mast out and take the sails out and put the very sensible sail plan back in for the rest of the week. They were working boats. They were really sturdy. They lasted for a long time. A lot of these boats lasted for 50, 60 years. They lasted past the time that anybody raced them, and they went back to just being working boats. But to give you an idea, if you look at a modern boat, usually the end of the boom is just right around the end of the transom of the hull. And if it's got a bowsprit at all, it might go out that far. The base of this sail plan, which is the length from the tip of the jib to the end of the mainsail, is twice the length of the hull. And it's pretty tall as well. The only way to actually control all that mainsail is that you've got all this rope here on what's called a boomkin in the back. And it keeps you have to get that leverage on the sail. Otherwise, the sail is just too big. And when the sailplane gets bigger, so does the crew. So in order to sail Annie, which we see a model of here, and there's the real boat. She's what's technically called a skimming dish. She's wide and shallow and stays way up on the top of the water. She doesn't have a deep keel. As a matter of fact, she's got no ballast whatsoever. There's not a single pound of lead or iron ballast in this boat to sort of keep it on its feet. It's all provided by a different kind of ballast, which we'll get to in just a minute. And, so this cockpit here is maybe about 10, 12 feet long. It held a crew of 16 people. Right. 16 folks were in there. One guy on the tiller, one guy handling the sail, probably with some assistance on the sail from some of the others, and 14 ballast handlers. And why is it called a sandbagger? Because the ballast is all provided by 50-pound bags, not of sand actually, because sand gets wet and the bag gets heavier, 50-pound bags of gravel, because gravel drains easily, just burlap bags of gravel. And those are handled by big guys who probably all weigh a couple 100 pounds apiece. And they all have to get up on the weather rail and are what in sailing parlance is known as rail meat. You are only there to weigh the boat down on the weather side and keep it from tipping over. And when you're going to come about in a boat like this, it's quite a choreographed operation. Coming about is turning through the wind and bringing the boat in a new direction, if you're not familiar with the term. And in order to do that, there's a lot of choreography involved, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Painters of the day, and James Butterworth was one of the foremost marine painters of the 19th century. This beautiful painting is privately owned. It's in a private collection. But take a look at this. There's a little bit of artistic license here. Anybody think they can see what's wrong about this painting?
Yeah.
Yeah, what?
It appears from what I see there that the wind is about 2 points off the starboard bow on the one in front of us. And
Yep.
If you look at the heeling of the boat on the other side, you know, it would put the
Yeah.
wind in an opposing
I think the angles are wrong. You're correct. But what I'm really looking at here is this is much, much bigger than an actual sandbagger. It's like a 3-to-1 sail ratio, and it's being weighed down by 4 guys. It would never stay up. So it's interesting when you look at old paintings, they're not always accurate. Buttersworth knew what he was doing. He knew how to paint a ship. He was a good draftsman, but he didn't want, you know, a large crowd in this boat.
He didn't paint what he saw.
That's right. So, you know, and the same thing with this lithograph. It's a little better, but there's still not enough people in it. What did a sandbagger really look like? Fortunately, we've got a photograph of the Hurley. It's a clown car in there. It's just, there's people all over it. And when I'm going to come about as the skipper of this boat, I'm going to have to say ready about, and I'm going to bring it through pretty slowly through the wind, because all of those guys have to, half of them will go over to the other side of the boat, just half, and they will start, and the half that are still on the windward side start throwing over the bags, literally tossing them, 50-pound bags, from one side to the other, and they have to do it, and the skipper has to judge the turn just right, because if they don't judge it just right, the boat goes over. It capsizes. And I will show you what this looks like at the end. But, you know, bear that in mind. It's not surprising to me that Buttersworth did not paint a whole crowd of people. It sort of ruins the whole look of the boat. It's not aesthetic anymore. So, the interesting thing was, as this became more popular, the boats became bigger, they went faster. In an age of more limited entertainment options, more and more and more people watched this. It was spectator sport. It was a huge spectator sport. And hundreds and hundreds of people would go out and watch sandbagger races. They'd also watch rowing races too. All sorts of speed on the water was popular spectator sport. And trust me, sports betting is nothing new. The whole excursion boats would be rented to go watch sandbagger races. And the wagering was going on and the drinking was going on the excursion boats. And they would just sit there, floating galleries of people watching these races. And the New York Yacht Club was also a popular place to watch sandbagger races. So what happens when they do go over? It's not like a small boat where you just stand on the keel and it pops right back up. However, it doesn't sink. Most boats, if you did this to them, they'd go right down. Why? Because there's a whole lot of ballast built into the boat. Here, the sandbags, the gravel bags, they just go all right in the water. So does the crew. Everybody ends up in the water. And the thing floats like a cork because it's completely made out of wood. And that's what happened here. So before they took Annie out to sail at the seaport, they actually did a capsize test to see what it was like. And this was both for safety reasons, but also to actually gather information on what it was like to sail one of these so that we would know better in the future. Because there really aren't many of these around. There's only 2 other sandbaggers that I'm aware of that still race. They're called Bull and Bear. Not surprisingly, they're owned by a stock trader. And there had always been some wonder about why the cockpit combing was so high on these cockpits. And everybody figured it was just a place to stack the gravel bags. Maybe it was, but also you'll notice that's the only thing that is above water, and you've got to bail this boat out when you actually get it back upright. When I say the betting was fierce, a race between the sandbagger Susie and Tiger was said to have drawn $50,000 worth of wagers in 1868. Excuse me, I'm transposing here. In today's money, that would be many millions of dollars. It would be probably $6 or $7 million worth of wagering, which, doesn't maybe seem like that much to us when we think about something like the Super Bowl. But when you think that this was all in one spot, right in the middle of New York Harbor, that's a lot of money. So one of the interesting things about sandbaggers is that they're the Wild West. There's almost no rules. Yacht clubs have not really taken over in the 1850s and 60s to the degree that they had today. There weren't many rules for racing. There was only one rule, and that was how long the boat was. You could make the sail plan as big as you wanted, and it didn't matter. Also, it was a very egalitarian sport. We think of yacht racing as being sort of an elite thing that's done by people that have a lot of money. It's not always true, but that's how we kind of think of it today. Sandbagger crews did have some wealthy young sports in them, as they were known at the time, but they also had a lot of longshore watermen, and everybody mixed together, and it was a lot of fun, and the sort of Wild West nature of the thing was part of its allure. Some captains would see that they were going to lose, and they'd just capsize their boat so that they didn't actually look like they'd lost. Or they needed to lighten up the boat, and so they'd start throwing over not only the gravel bags, but the crew members as well to lighten up the boat and go a little faster downwind towards the final mark. And sandbagging racing really stopped when that spirit of extreme sports went out of it. A number of the yacht clubs said, yeah, we're still going to do race sandbaggers, but you have to be a member of the yacht club. All of a sudden, all the watermen were out of it. They weren't allowed in anymore. Also, they started introducing rules. And for the people that found sandbaggers a lot of fun, it kind of destroyed the fun after that. And so yacht racing became, in general, a little more sane after that. But it is interesting, how many rules get introduced into something that had a spirit of adventure in it, and that's why it got started to begin with. And think about some extreme sports, maybe wingsuits are a good example, that don't have any rules. It's just, staying alive is the rule. And that's kind of the spirit that infected the sandbaggers as well. So although they start racing by the 1850s or so, they are pretty much done by about 1885. And at the same time, yacht racing is becoming much, much more popular. It's covered in the newspapers, but sandbaggers were kind of what started it. They were the first true racing boats that raced in what we would think of as regattas today. So they're an important boat to remember in terms of yachting history. So let's take ourselves out of the 90-degree Texas heat and get into something a little chillier. We're going to talk about ice scooters. Anybody ever seen an ice scooter before? If sandbaggers are unusual, ice scooters a little more unusual. And they're very, very localized. Ice scooters were really only found to begin with on the Great South Bay in Long Island. We'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a minute. They did grow to other places, it's true. but they started in the Great South Bay. And they started like the New York sloop boat begets the sandbagger. This starts with another boat type. Anybody ever heard of a sneak box? It's a hunting boat, right? These were originally created on the coast of New Jersey in 1836, so they go way back. And in essence, it's like making a hole in the water from which you can hunt. And they were used both by amateur hunters as well as professional hunters. An awful lot of restaurants' food supply came from professional hunters who would go out into a marsh in a sneak boat. And a sneak boat can be sailed, it can be poled with a pole, or it can be rowed. And you get a little bit of a sense of that. This is a modern photograph in the upper right, but you see how the sneak box was intended to be used. You actually put brush or reeds or salt hay up on the top of the sneak box to turn it into, in essence, into a floating blind. And you can see this guy is, his boat's pretty much invisible to a bird, I would think. You can also see in this model of a sneak box up here that they would put sails on them occasionally, although they were usually very low. They were not great sailors. The sail just kind of pushed it to where it needed to be in the marsh. A lot of the time you would actually pole it through the marsh. You'd just take a long 10-foot pole and you'd pole it through the shallow water till you got it where you needed to get it. So what do sneak boxes have to do with ice boats? This is the Great South Bay on Long Island. So there's New York City down there. Here's Long Island. And there's the Great South Bay. And I've got a little bit more of a magnification of it. It's an interesting body of water that has been used by fishermen. It's very shallow. So it's subject to great temperature change. If it's really cold out, the Great South Bay will get cold. And you say, well, salt water doesn't really freeze all that well. Well, look at how many entrances there are into the Great South Bay. Not that much. There's a lot of water coming into the bay from the island itself. And then there is salt water coming in through this way, and it means that the water is not salt but brackish. And in cold winters, such as we were much more subject to in historical times than we are today, it would freeze over pretty much every winter. And at the same time, because it's brackish water, there would be saltier areas of the Great South Bay that didn't freeze over. And the Great South Bay was used for sporting reasons, but it was also very much used for commercial reasons in the 18th and 19th century. There's a lot of fish in there. There's a lot of fishing done in there. There was hunting done in there. And the precursor of the Coast Guard were life-saving stations that were positioned all up and down the coast. And the life-saving stations, the lifeboat stations in the Great South Bay had a problem in that when the bay freezes over, boats, ships can get stranded, and they can be unreachable because you can't take a boat easily to them because there's ice in the way. You can't take an ice boat to them because there's water in the way. A regular ice boat would just sink. It doesn't have a hull. It's just got runners and a frame. So there was no easy way to get out to these boats. And yet the life-saving stations noticed that some of the hunters would actually take their sneak boxes out and they would drag them across the ice or pole them across the ice in some cases and then row them across the water. And so they were able to get around. And they realized this was a way to get across icy water. And it didn't take too long before, once again, the spirit of innovation that you see constantly in sport and in sailing and in all different kinds of sports takes over, and they take, some bright spark says, let's put a sail on it. You can put a sail on a sneak box. Well, let's put a sail on it and put some runners on the bottom of it. and the sneak box is born. And this happens around the 1870s, 1880s. And these boats are mostly just used by the life-saving stations to begin with. It's a great way if you've got a schooner stuck in the ice, stranded in the ice 2 miles out, and there's water and ice in between them and you can supply them with food, you can take them off the boat if they need to. Usually the crews just stayed there until it's thawed. You can also supply some more remote areas of the Great South Bay with mail, with other supplies. So the life-saving stations really started to utilize these boats. Well, how long do you think it takes before somebody says, well, that looks like fun? And so these little sneak boxes were turned into purely sport versions of these boats. And they're about 10, 12 feet long. They're not terribly long. Unlike the real sneak box, it's just got sort of a footwell. It's not a true cockpit the way you would sit in with the sneak box. They put a bowsprit on them and a pretty big rig. And the runners on the bottom, there's 4 of them running along the hull. 2 that are even with each other on the bottom, in the middle of the hull, and then 2 outriggers that are located a little higher up. And they're just wooden runners with iron angle irons on them. That's all it is. And you'll see one in a couple of minutes in a video. So this photograph is from about 1910, 20 area. And you can see they're not very big. And when you see one in action, you'll see that they're pretty small. No, this is a little longer than that. It's about 10, 12 feet long. You can get 3 or 4 people on them. So one of the interesting things about these is when they're going at speed, and speed is about 35 to 40 knots in one of these, and they hit the water, they will skip like a stone. And so this is the scooter Stuff, and the captain is Charles Buckridge, who you see here on the bow with his fedora on. I kind of like to imagine that he went to church on Sunday and then afterwards said, now I'm going to go have some fun on the scooter. But when they hit the ice again after coming out of the water, they literally jump out of the water. It's pretty dramatic. And they had whole regattas with these, and they were community events. Folks from the coastal towns along the Great South Bay, they'd all have a scooter in the family. It was pretty cheap. It was easy, accessible fun for just about anybody. You did not have to be wealthy to own one of these. So this footage, although a little blurry, is from the 1970s. And I may run it twice because it's only 10 seconds long, but you're really going to understand why ice scootering is exciting. There's no sound. Okay, so he hits the water, skips like a stone, and bounces back onto the ice. If you don't think that's an exciting ride, let me see if we can just run that once more. It's amazing how far film technology has come in the last 50 years. And you can see there's 4 people on that scooter. And yet, as I said before, maybe 10, 12 feet long, no more than that. Now, we had an incredibly cold winter up north. I don't know what it was like down here last winter. And a close friend of mine who works at Mystic Seaport doing research on Long Island boat types has really gotten interested in the ice scooters. And Kate got a call from one of the ice scooter folks on a Friday evening, and they said, conditions are okay. We're going out tomorrow morning. Do you want to come? And she said, can I bring my son with me? He's 8.5, Reed. And they said, yeah, sure, that'd be great. And so they had to get on in the car, go down to the ferry in New London, take the ferry across to the island. They got there at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'll do a little bit of a narration of this as it goes along. This boat is called Silver Bullet. It's not old. It was actually built during the pandemic. This is a much older one. It's not going terribly fast here. That boat's well over 100 years old. This was on Saturday. She came back on Sunday because they were having better wind. And so this is what better wind looks like. The skipper of the boat judged they were going about 35 to 40 knots. You can see the angle iron on the bottom of the runners. The guy who owns this boat looked around for an old one during the pandemic, and he tried and tried and tried and couldn't find one, but he runs an aluminum fabricating business, and so he just built his own, but he built it out of aluminum. The runners are wood with the angle irons in steel on the bottom. The ice had started to get a little soft. There's no patches of water when they were out that day, but you can see that the runners are really digging the ice a little bit there. It's a rough ride. The ice is never smooth out there. This is the first time in 11 years that the Great South Bay has frozen, and they've been able to take their scooters out. The interesting thing, of course, is if the boat goes over on the ice, it's a little bit of a hard landing, but you just skitter across the ice. It's not really as dangerous as you might think a 40-mile-per-hour collision would be. Now, there's no tiller and no rudder on an ice scooter. A rudder would catch if you went into the water when it came back onto the ice. And if you used a normal skid, as you would with a regular ice boat, that would also catch on the ice. So these are steered not at the stern, but the captain is actually the guy who's got his hand on the jib sheet in front of the mast. And by moving the jib sheet around, it turns the boat. You can also adjust your balance. That will also affect the direction a little bit. And look at how far he's sliding, even though he's going directly into the wind at this point. And I am told by experienced scooter sailors that if you pull too hard on the jib, it just starts spinning. So you have to be very temperate with how much you control it. That's Reed over there. That's Kate's son. And he just, now here's something that you can't do in a normal sailboat, which is go backwards. So that was February 12th of this year, and that's where that finishes. I think the scooters are just a fascinating example of homespun innovation. As you point out, they do exist in some other places, but they started here, and for a long time, this is the only place they were located. A lot of boats, and you can find these here in the Gulf, you can find them all around coasts, all over the U.S. A lot of boats are adapted specifically for the waters in which they sail. And this is true all over the world, but it's certainly true here, and it's one reason why Mystic Seaport has 450 small watercraft, because there are all these different vernacular types of watercraft that just have a specific purpose. And some of them are fascinating and quite crude, apparently. Oyster fishermen in Long Island Sound continued to use log canoes, just the way the Native Americans made back, for thousands of years. They continued to use log canoes until the early 20th century. It's not what you would expect. but they were well suited to oyster tonging. All right, we are going to finish up with a powerboat for all of you powerboaters. This was a story that I kind of stumbled across. I don't know, does anybody read Wooden Boat Magazine here? Okay, I do, I've subscribed to it for years, but the name Maynard Bray is sort of an old, very original part of the wooden boat revival that goes back to the 70s. And Maynard discovered a boat by William Hand that's called the Paiute 2 model, and they were designed to be built in your backyard. Boating magazines were filled with these build them at home, think about Popular Mechanics magazine and so forth, build whatever at home. They'd have boats in them too. But the boating magazines all did, and designers would design these boats. And the Paiute 2 model was a hand-built, in your backyard, a 25-foot inboard runabout. And so the two guys who did this, William Bonnell and, William Nutting and Ted Bonnell, were founding members of the Cruising Club of America. And this was before the Cruising Club had been founded. They were both writers occasionally, especially Bill Nutting was a writer for Motorboat Magazine and for a lot of other magazines. He was a journalist. Bonnell was really, he was a tax attorney and doesn't seem like he'd be the adventuresome sort, but he really was. And so the first of these Paiute 2 models that Bonnell builds is Old Glory 2. He owned 4 Old Glory boats. 2 of them were this kind, and 2 of them were sailboats. But he builds the first one in his backyard in suburban New York, and finishes it, puts the engine in, but hasn't hooked it up, takes it down to the waterfront, hooks up the engine, goes twice around the harbor, then loads up his wife and another couple onto the boat, and off they go to Nova Scotia. No sea trials. And it worked out just fine, and he wrote about it in this article, Motor Boating, which is not Motor Boat, which is the other magazine we're going to talk about, in 1912. And while I was doing some research on this, because we had one of these at the seaport, have one, they've got it on display now, because I wanted to find out a little bit more about this trip. And one of my volunteer researchers found an article that referenced that he and Bill Nutting, well, immediately that's not 2 couples, it's 2 guys, were waving to troops going off to do their bit at the front. I'm like, well, that's not 1912, that's World War I. And as I dug into it a little bit more, I was able to find Motorboating Magazine, and there's George, who is also known as Ted, and Bill Nutting. I was able to find that they had actually written 4 different articles about their trip. And it's quite the adventure. Today, if we did this in a powerboat, no big deal. I mean, it's a cruise, but it's not an adventure necessarily, other than a small one, but it's totally safe, it's totally predictable. But when these guys go in 1916, they're going with a 1916 era gasoline engine. Not exactly the most reliable beast in the world. It was brand new, been broken in, but it was brand new. They don't have a heck of a lot of navigation equipment. GPS doesn't exist, radar doesn't exist. All these things that we sort of take for granted today, they're not there. This is a true adventure, and it could have gone very wrong for them. So, Old Glory 3, V-bottom runabout, William Hand, there he is down in the lower right. This is the size I found the engine in in an advertisement in Motorboat Magazine. It was just a few pages away. And I'm sure they got the Scripps Company to advertise in the magazine because they were going to be writing about their super reliable engine that went all the way to Canada. 24 feet long, 5 foot 6 inch wide, 1 foot draft. Not exactly a really blue water boat. And most of the time they were inside of shore, but nonetheless. There's sort of a casual devil-may-care attitude about the whole thing. And they just sort of, this is the fine art of traveling heavy here. They pack the boat with whatever they need, and I love that, there's a wicker chair just sort of casually piled on top of everything else. And they had very carefully thought about what they would need in terms of food, in terms of gas, all these different things. They had thought about this carefully enough, but they hadn't maybe thought well enough about, what else could happen. Nice view of the engine up front there. But look at all of this stuff that's going into an open cockpit boat. It did, you will notice, have a bimini top. So they were sort of at least out of the rain, and I guess out of the sun, although sun turned out not to be an issue on this particular trip. So there's the route they took. It's starting here in Port Washington, New York, going up inside Long Island, going through the Cape Cod Canal, going up the coast, and then they get up here and they decide not to stick to the coast. They just cut right across the Bay of Fundy. So this is one interesting reason about the Cape Cod Canal, which, if you're familiar with Cape Cod, just cuts miles and days off of a sailing trip around it. It had opened 2 months before they went through it. And when they came to the fuel dock for gas, there was nobody there and there wasn't any gas. They had to wait about 8 hours before anybody showed up with gasoline. So the big problem here is that almost the entire trip is in the fog. The green lines, those were the only place, I put those onto the map, those are the only places in the whole trip where it wasn't foggy. Everything else was solid fog. Fog to the point where you often could not see the end of the boat from one end to the other. They don't know what marine traffic is out there. They have no means of telling. Radar doesn't exist yet. They've got a foghorn. They make liberal use of it. I love this photograph. He's been the whole night driving through the fog, and he just looks grimly determined here. And you can see, you can see just how foggy it was. That bell buoy is 20, 30 yards away, and you can't see anything past it. And remember, if you're going to navigate at this time period, you are totally reliant on your charts, your compass, and your visual landmarks. And that's a visual landmark. In order to know which direction to go next, they have to find that buoy or some other landmark that they've picked out as a waypoint. And this was all of the navigation equipment they had. 6-inch Ritchie compass and binnacle, which didn't work because they had failed to account for metal in the hull that was moving the compass off of its true bearing. They had not boxed the compass properly, and as a result, they would take the 2.5-inch compass that they had, which is in this picture, and they would verify that the 6.5-inch compass in the binnacle up front was actually working. So they're using a compass this big to go to Canada. What else have they got? They've got parallel rules and a protractor used to read the chart. They've got a sounding lead and 300 feet of line. So there's no depth meter on this boat. Obviously, that doesn't exist yet because it requires sonar. So they have a sounding lead, which means it's a lead that you throw over. It's got a little wax in the top, and you can see what the bottom is. And if you read your charts properly, maybe you can figure out where you are, but you can definitely tell how deep the water is. They have a taffrail log. This is how sailing ships in the 17th century used to determine their speed. But the knot meter wasn't working properly. The engine was, luckily, but the knot meter wasn't working properly because it was a new and fairly unreliable piece of equipment. And so here he is. Here's Bonnell actually reading the log as he strings it off the back of the boat and determining how many knots they're going. Why is this important? Because you can't see where you are. So you use something called dead reckoning. It's a combination of determining the wind, determining the speed of the boat, and your compass heading. And using those three things, you look at the chart and you say, well, we've been going 7 knots pretty reliably, so that's this amount of distance, and we've been heading in this direction, so we should be, and you put a circle on the chart and you say, we should be about here. It's not very accurate. That's why it's called dead reckoning. And they also end up in a ferocious storm. Think about, and that picture was actually drawn by one of them. I've forgotten whether it was Bonnell or Nutting. But they threw over a sea anchor. And if you don't know what a sea anchor is, there's a picture of it here. It's also called a drogue chute sometimes. And it actually catches water in it, and it slows the boat down. It goes a little deeper, and it keeps the boat from drifting too quickly. And they threw it overboard because they knew they weren't too far from the Canadian coast. And they couldn't drift forever in this storm, which lasted, I think, 28, 30 hours. It was a long time. And they're hunkered down under that bimini. That's the only protection they have from this storm. And they're bailing occasionally, and it was pretty scary. And yet, they made it through. The fog lifted just as they came up on the coast, and their dead reckoning turned out to be accurate. They were about 10 miles away from where they thought they were on the Canadian coast. And but it is a testament to just how wet it was out there that Bonnell noted that all of the varnish on the boat had turned white because it had become so infiltrated by water. You know how when you stick your glass down on a varnished table? Well, marine varnish doesn't tend to do that, but it had been so wet out there that had happened to all of the varnish on the boat.
Varnish wasn't dry. Varnish wasn't dry.
Well, it's maybe too. So remember that I said they saw this troop transport, which had American volunteers on it in 1916. So there they are, and they gave the ensign from Old Glory 3 to the crew, so they're flying it up there. And when they came back, it was a much less eventful trip, but there's something that happened during the trip that tells you exactly how much more difficult navigation was in 1916 than it is today. The Hen and Chickens lightship, we don't have lightships anymore. They were, in essence, lighthouses that were out at sea a few miles. But they were navigational points, very important navigational points for marine traffic. And the Hen and Chickens lightship, which is sort of off of Westport, Massachusetts, was their next waypoint. It was pitch black. They ran at night, and they were looking for the Hen and Chickens lightship because that was their next. Hen and Chickens are a reef. That was their next waypoint, and from there they had to steer a different compass course and head off into the dark night. There's a lot less lights then than there are today, and they needed this lightship to make the next turn. And they see 2 lights, and they think that one of them is the Hen and Chickens lightship, and they're not sure what the other one is. But they go for the brighter one, and they follow it for an hour. Then they follow it for another 2 hours. And then they realize they're chasing a steamship. Now, if you missed your waypoint today, you just go and look at the GPS and you'd say, well, this is where I am. Turn the boat this way, and you're headed off. They can't do that. They've now been following something that's moving, and they have no clue where they are. So they turn around 180 degrees to follow the opposite compass bearing and go all the way back to try and find that other light source, which was, of course, the Hen and Chickens lightship. And they go all the way back, and they literally sailed right up to the side of it to make sure that they were looking at the right thing this time. Then they set their compass from there, and the next morning they were inside of Long Island Sound and on their way home. Their original goal had been to make this trip in 2 weeks, round trip. It took them 2 weeks and 4 hours. And if it hadn't been for the fog, they would have made it much more easily. But it's a fantastic story of guys just looking for an adventure. Now, there may have been a little money in it for the magazine articles that happened, but it was about maybe a little bit about the success of the magazine. But Nutting was an appropriate last name for Bill Nutting. He, when they were founding the Cruising Club of America, he said, "Are we just going to be all about safety? There's no fun in safety. I'd hate to think that we were being bound by rules of safety." Well, I'm sorry to say that in 1924, 8 years after this voyage, Nutting and 3 other friends got onto a boat that they were sailing from Norway to North America, and they were never seen again. And Bill Nutting looks like a very romantic character here, but when he took his hat off and wanted to look silly, he was kind of a short, bald, silly-looking man. So, oh, my paper's got a little. Excuse me, I'm looking for some quotes that I've got here. This is what happens when your papers fall on the floor right in the middle of the lecture. Here we go. One of his friends said of him when he died, Bennell said of him, "He was a charming character and good company, a good sailor in some ways, but foolhardy and had too much courage." Rufus Burnham, who was Motorboat's editor-in-chief at that point, and also a close friend, said, "Bill was a daring and often reckless sailor who took risks. He may have been swamped or drowned when all hands were asleep. Or he may have had a fire on board, as he was not too careful with matches around gasoline." So, sadly, that was the end of Bill Nutting, who did leave a wife and daughter. This is Mystic Seaport's Pyote 3 design. It's Gramp. And for a while, Maynard Bray, who I mentioned earlier, thought that Gramp might actually be Old Glory 3. I talked to him about a year ago, and now he's not so sure. So since he was the one who found Gramp to begin with, nonetheless, it's a wonderful boat. It is the same type of boat, exactly the same type of boat, also handmade by somebody in their backyard, just as Bonnell made 2 copies of this. Usually these boats were pretty straight-sided, as you can see here. They don't require really serious boat building skills to build. But nonetheless, if you can sail it from New York to Canada, it's not a bad thing. So is it Old Glory 3? I don't know, and I don't know that we'll ever know. But it is a great sea yarn, and well worth telling. And with that, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Oh, if you've got a question, this way the folks on YouTube can hear you too.
Are you familiar with the bay schooners like we used to have down in this area?
Sure. Yeah, I know.
Hauling rice across the bay.
I know.
and such.
I know quite a few of the main schooners. I don't know I know some of them have moved down here as well.
Well, these are different. These are flat bottom with a centerboard, half moon centerboard in them. But you know, they were a lot like the originals here, which you were talking about, your sandbaggers, except they were bigger.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
were bigger, but they had flat bottom schooner rigged,
Right.
and they used a lot of those for commerce to haul things across the bay. The bays down here, and, you know, we're a swampy area too, so we had
Right.
we used them for oysters, you know,
Yep.
seafood, all kind of, and rice, and all kind of stuff.
Exactly, and
And,
it's
yeah.
and they're fascinating to look at because so many different boats get created in so many different places that are just designed for that place.
But boy, they were ugly. They weren't. Seriously, y'all up north were a lot better, you know, artistic shipbuilders than we down
Yeah,
here.
I don't know. We have an old engine. They have an old engine at Mystic Seaport that's a Kahlenberg, and it's a semi-diesel, and it was mostly used to power something called a fish tug on the Great Lakes. And they've got this big boxy stern and these great big barn doors, and they go out fishing with them in the middle of the winter on the Great Lakes. And the engine would sit in the middle of the boat, and the engine kept the boat warm because it's this big tank of an engine in the middle. And when they were ready to go fishing, they'd open up the back doors. And you want to talk ugly? Those are ugly, ugly boats. So yeah, not all of them are graceful, but they are useful and utilitarian.
They're very utilitarian.
Yeah,
They can
yeah.
handle anything.
That's right, that's right. But very specific to these waters and the tasks they need to do.
Yes, I'm sorry that I came in a little late, but I saw that last photo of the sandbaggers, and it looked like the lines of a catboat. But were catboats used?
Not in sandbagging races. Catboats were certainly used as race boats, particularly in New England, Cape Cod. The Cape Cod catboat, the Crosby family on Cape Cod is said to be the first type to originate the Cape Cod catboat. But catboats, if you don't know, have a mast stepped right up in the bow of the boat and one big sail. So technically, a sandbagger is a sloop, not a catboat. But one of the things that makes them look a little alike is that the sandbaggers have a plumb, very straight stem, and so do the catboats. And they're both very wide boats as well. But catboats are a little deeper in the draft, and even though they're designed to go in thin water, just like the ones we were talking about here in the bays in the Gulf. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Did ice scooter boats ever develop into a racing culture? And if so, how did they manage spectators?
The racing was, well, first of all, it was always very cold out when there were races. So, no, it's what we tend to refer to as a hyper-local type. And sometimes hyper-local types go further away. So sandbaggers I brought up for a couple of reasons, and I forgot to mention this during the sandbagger section. As sandbaggers started to phase out a little bit in the 1870s and 1880s up north, they went to other areas. And sandbaggers, as it turns out, were very well suited towards the Gulf here. So there were sandbagger fleets in Louisiana, and I'm not sure about Texas, but they were in the Gulf, and they were quite competitive. And it's because the winds could be quite light and the waters could be fairly calm. And that's another reason why this is actually what I'm showing here is another Great South Bay innovation. It is a catboat, and you can see just how up front that mast is. It's right up in the eyes of the boat. But they had to be able to sail in really thin water, very shallow water. And sandbaggers could do that down here. And the other interesting thing about the Great South Bay is that the winds blow across the Atlantic and the waves come across the Atlantic, but they hit all the sandbars outside of Great South Bay, but the winds blow right over it. So you get a lot of wind in Great South Bay, but not a lot of steep water. And it allows you to utilize certain designs of boats. So does that answer the question?
We've got time for one more question.
Okay, I've questioned you out.